to think about, though. We are in the year 2011, and still to this day, there are children who are born. For example, I worked with this little girl about 2 years ago who was born. Family had 2 or 3 older daughters, so this was like the third or fourth daughter that they'd had. And so mom and dad were a little bit older, and they had her at the hospital, and everything went great, and they took her home from the hospital. Nothing's wrong with their child, right? Everything had gone well. The doctor released them. At the 1 week baby checkup, the family goes in with their daughter, and the pediatrician tells them, oh, well, your child has Down syndrome. So they'd had their child home with them for a whole week. No one had told them when the baby was born that the child had Down syndrome. So I just had to throw that out there because I was just shocked that this could occur. And can you imagine what then the family, instead of already having that week to deal with that, they were struggling with the way that unfolded in their lives, but thrilled to have a healthy little girl join them. Okay, the next area that I was going to discuss was fetal alcohol syndrome. I disagree with the textbook on the fact that it says that it is a congenital syndrome, and then in parentheses it says it's noticed at birth but not inherited. I would disagree. There are children who are born with fetal alcohol syndrome that are not diagnosed at birth, that do not have physical characteristics, and often will not get diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome until they are children, school age, sometimes even teenagers, when they start to engage in some behaviors that are difficult for the parents to deal with. They seek help maybe from the psychiatric community for some of these issues and find out, wow, this child has fetal alcohol syndrome. So, can't always see it. However, there are some facial characteristics, and if you Google fetal alcohol syndrome, there'll be some pictures. Some of the typical things that I always think about is that really narrow upper lip. It's a thin upper lip. Their upper lip tends to be restricted. A lot of times you'll also see the epicanthal folds, which if you look at the insides of your eyes right here, there'll be a bunching up of tissue right here. So it's kind of a fold like that. That would also indicate that the parent used alcohol during her gestation. There are other things that they talk about here as physical characteristics as well. Some of the issues that these individuals encounter when they do get older would be kind of just deviant behavior as far as with society. Children who have fetal alcohol syndrome tend to go on and have difficulties with following rules. They engage in criminal behavior. A lot of what it has to do with is it's neurodevelopmental in nature, and that they do not have some of the key issues from a neurological standpoint working for them. So you are faced with a situation and the bells go off in your head like, bad idea, bad idea, bad idea. These kids don't really have those bells going off to indicate to them that they should not engage in a particular activity. Their impulse control is very low. They just really struggle in harnessing those impulses. a lot of these kids are diagnosed with attention deficit, or the other thing that you'll hear would be the statement, they're defiant. You get that. Defiant is often a word that's used for kids that actually have fetal alcohol syndrome. And there are ways to parent these children, and they can oftentimes be very loving kids, can do well academically, and with the right behavior plans can go on to live very fruitful lives. Fragile X syndrome. I've worked with a child with Fragile X syndrome as well. I thought he was autistic for quite a while. He had a lot of similar characteristics to a child with autism. He had very unusual sound production. There was the intonation patterns were unusual. He did not produce a whole lot of speech. He was very quiet. He also had difficulties with ear infections. He was often sick. And the book says that a notable language feature of Fragile X would be that kids tend to perseverate on specific word or phrase and don't have some of the social abilities in communication. Also, it says that children with with Fragile X may not use gestures effectively, and that was the case with this little guy that I worked with. I just did not understand why he did not gesture. He would not reach for things or point for things, and I did not understand that piece. Fragile X often is something that will be diagnosed when autism is thought to be going on, and that was indeed the case with this little guy. He went for a developmental assessment with a team in the Chicago area that I had recommended, and one of the recommendations that they gave was for him to have blood work done. Pretty extensive blood panel. And so when the parents came back, they were a little distraught because they were really expecting, I think, to get a diagnosis of autism, and found out that the blood panel that was recommended by the team was going to be something that was very expensive, and they asked, well, do you think this is something we need to do? And I was a member of the early intervention team working with the family, and I told them that, yes, I understood that it was quite costly, but I think that it was worth checking out because maybe there was a metabolic disorder going on that could assist in his treatment. And so they did pursue that blood work, and the blood work was what told them that Fragile X was going on. So that is my experience with that particular situation. He does meet the criteria for having mental retardation as well. I think he was moderately mentally retarded as well. Prader-Willi is something that I haven't had a lot of experience with. A child that I worked with was diagnosed with that shortly after. I worked with him for a brief period of time, and typically what you hear of with Prader-Willi, and this is, I've found that pediatricians jump to Prader-Willi if there's a child who tends to have a voracious appetite. That's something that they kind of head right to, because that is one of the hallmark signs in children. And of course, since they have a voracious appetite, they tend to also be overweight. On the flip side, infants with Prader-Willi have feeding problems due to the fact that they have a high narrow palate. So it makes it difficult for them to eat effectively. They also have micrognathia, which is a small lower jaw. Finally, due to the physiological and anatomical differences that they have in the oral cavity, it does affect their nasality as well. And there are specific things that Prader-Willi children with Prader-Willi syndrome do experience in regards to language as well. You can check that out on page 368. Cry-to-chat is a syndrome I'm not going to really give you any examples of. It's in the book. I haven't personally ever worked with it, so I can't give you my personal experiences with that, as well as with Williams syndrome. I have not experienced that as well. In your cleft palate and syndrome course that you're taking with Mrs. Queasel, she probably goes into this stuff in quite a lot of detail, I imagine. Okay, let's go ahead and stop for this portion, and I will do the second half of it on the